Some punishments are worse than death, especially back in the Victorian times. So you might be familiar with this first punishment. You might have heard about it during witch trials, but it was used throughout Victorian times on a lot of women. So ever hear of a Scold's bridle? Also known as a witch's bridle, a gossip's bridle, a brank's bridle, or simply branks, this was an instrument of punishment normally used for public humiliation. It was an iron muzzle in an iron framework that enclosed the head, where a bridle bit or curb plate, about 5 cm by 2.5 cm in size, was slid into the mouth, pressed down on top of the tongue, and often it had a little spiky just to compress the tongue even further. What would it do? Well, it would stop you from speaking, and also cause extreme pain, psychological trauma, just to scare and intimidate you into submission. This would obviously prevent any kind of talking and resulted in many unpleasant side effects for the wearer, including excessive salivation and fatigue in the mouth. Also, while you're wearing it, normally you're going to be led around town by a leash. And if somebody was feeling really fun that day, you could add a little bell just to draw in the crowds. So all of this was done mostly because if you were considered to be rude, because a rude woman was not allowed back then, if you were considered a nag, a common scold, a misbehaving maid, game over for you. It could also be corporal punishment if you were already in a workhouse. Not super fun. It's just not great. The Pear of Anguish is a device that early modern Europeans labeled as a torment device, and rightfully so. Supposedly, somebody would insert this device into a person's mouth, or you could insert it into other places, pick a hole, any hole, in order to widen the orifice, causing extreme pain. It was a pear-shaped instrument consisting of 4 leaves that slowly separated from each other as the inflictor of pain turned the screw at the top. Now, there are a number of examples of ornate and elaborate pear-shaped devices with 3 or 4 leaves or lobes, driven by turning a key that rotates the central screw thread, which spreads the leaves, and these are held in museums devoted to the subject of punishment. And hey, some of these have little spikes, just for funsies. Do we know why? No. I'm just assuming for the purpose of pain. Used as a horrible punishment for women, the chest ripper was used to inflict pain, fluid loss, and the obvious damage of specific sacks of flesh. This was usually used for a woman accused of conducting adultery. So these claws were often placed red hot onto the victim's exposed body part, the spikes penetrating to achieve a powerful grasp. They were then pulled to rip off or shred what they were attached to. Look, if you weren't killed by this, you'd be at least scarred for life, because this would be torn apart. A common variant was known as the spider, which was a similar instrument but attached to a wall. So then you'd attach your sacks of flesh to the claws, and then you'd be pulled by the punisher away from the wall, which would once again remove or harm what was being clamped at. This was very brutal, and 9 times out of 10 you'd die from it. And honestly, I think I'd prefer to die from it instead of surviving that. The Judas cradle was a macabre invention and involved lowering victims onto a sharp pyramid-shaped seat. It was believed that the damn thing was named after Judas as a means of punishing those who were deemed to have betrayed somebody. So, suspended above the ground, a victim's weight would gradually force the point into the body, causing, as you can imagine, unbearable pain. Sometimes you could add a weight to somebody's legs, just to increase the pain, maybe give you a quicker death. Other times we could use oil as a lubricant, which once again increases the pain. Various innovations were used to make the torment on this a lot more painful. So for starters, the device was never washed, so you get infection! So even if you survive, you'll die by side effects. Among other methods, the victim was repeatedly pushed down on the pyramid, once again to increase pain. Sometimes you could raise somebody with some ropes, get a moment of respite, but that's not mercy, that's just prolonging misery. This device was made to symbolize physical and psychological torment, because eventually your body would succumb to the relentless agony. A shrew, not unlike a scold, was a boisterous and dominating woman who would not relegate herself to the role society assigned to her. So if a shrew dared to fall out of line, she might be met with the shrew's fiddle. Though similar to a fiddle in shape, its resemblance to the vibrant sounding instrument kinda stopped at the name. With a large opening for the neck and 2 smaller openings for the wrists, this fiddle locked its wearer's head in place and restrained and immobilized her arms, which were essentially handcuffed in front of her face. Afterwards, well, you can imagine what folks would do if you've just got somebody standing there in the town square. Yeah. A ducking school, not to be confused with a cucking chair, which is a whole other concept, or the red-hot stools women accused of having acts with the devil would have to sit on, was a wild form of punishment back in the day. So this was a strongly made wooden armchair, often made out of oak, in which the offender was seated, with an iron band being placed around them, so they're not going to fall out during their immersion. So usually you'd have kind of like a seesaw. You'd fasten the chair to a long wooden beam, you put it on the edge of a river. So sometimes this was not a fixture. Sometimes it was mounted on a pair of wooden wheels. so that you could wheel this through the streets first, because extra humiliation, people loved that. And then when you get to the river edge, you'd hang it by a chain and then dunk people in the water until you get what you want out of them. So when folks really wanted to get answers back in the day from somebody, they didn't really care about being humane, they just wanted to be right. So they would do whatever they deemed necessary to get a confession, leading to many women confessing to crimes just to make pain stop and end their lives humanely. So how would they do all this heinous stuff? Well, let's see. Say goodbye to your fingernails, folks. That was practically just a footnote in what was allowed to be done to women. Well, Perga Hosmanin of Bavaria was led through multiple different stages of harm while being paraded to her death. So at her first stop, her left chest piece and right arm were branded with irons, then her right chest at the second stop, left arm at the third, left hand at the fourth, and once they got to the place where she was going to die, her right hand, which was what she used to make her oath as a midwife, well, she just lost that entirely. And then they burnt her alive. And her ashes? Oh no, you can't leave those on soil. No, not allowed. They dumped it in a stream. So probably the most extreme extent of this was a punishment normally reserved for killers. But hey, if folks were like, no, you're bad enough, and you didn't confess, or maybe you did, let's see what happens. You ready, folks? So we're gonna strap you to 4 horses, with one arm or leg attached to each separate horse, and then on command, horses would start running, and then, you can imagine, we're not, Betty Spaghetti, things go after that you kinda die pretty quickly. Painfully, but quickly. Here's another doozy of a way to punish a scold. The community would stage a charivari, also known as rough music, a skimmington and carding. Clanging pots and pans, townspeople would gather in the streets, their music drawing attention to the offending scold, who often rode backwards on a horse or mule. She faced the wrong way to symbolize the transgressive reversal of gender roles. So here's the kicker, by the way. The legal crime of being a scold or shrew was not removed from English and Welsh law until 1967, the year Hollywood released The Taming of the Shrew, starring Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. Also throughout history, this type of punishment was staged for adulterers, harlots, and more. Women during the Victorian era just had a rough time. They were expected to be quiet, to follow the rules, and they had different chances than men for education and jobs. And that's just a very polite way of saying they had less of a chance of being educated unless they were very well off. And even then, it was only like ladylike studies or nothing. The idea back then was that women should only be focused on their families, and not have their dreams and ambitions. This unfair treatment of women and not valuing their opinions was a form of punishment, and still kind of is sometimes. If you've ever been on a treadmill and thought, this feels like torment, you're actually not far from the truth. In order to reform idle convicts and combat crime that plagued the Victorian era, Sir William Cubitt invented the everlasting staircase in 1818. It was a large, imposing 24-spoked paddle wheel that could handle as many as 40 convicts endlessly climbing. They were isolated in compartments and forced to climb for hours each day. The purpose was to crush their wills with the monotony and severity of hard labor, but they wound up irreparably damaging the health of the folks. One prisoner said, "I have worked for months on the wheel. I was quite well on coming in. I now have a great pain in the back part of my legs, my loins, and my left side. I get weaker every day. I can hardly stand upright. I know not how I shall be able to do a day's work. I have nothing to depend upon but my labor." Luckily, the use of tread wheels was abolished in Britain by the Prisons Act of 1898. So hey, next time you finish a grueling workout, be thankful you have the freedom to stop when you're tired. Well, that's all for today, folks. I've been Alexa. See ya!